This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. It's at this point in the conservation that my attention can be turned to the exciting part, the image itself. But I wouldn't be here without all of that hidden structural work completed. It's too bad I didn't have somebody like Squarespace to do it all for me. With thousands of beautifully designed templates that work everywhere and anywhere, Squarespace will have you looking good. And with their new fluid design technology, you can drag and drop elements around your website to change things up or customize it as you see fit without the need of any code. But that doesn't mean it's just a pretty website. Under the hood is massive technology. From search engine optimization, e-commerce solutions, mailing lists, online scheduling, social media integration, shipping solutions, and more. Pretty much everything you need to run a successful business. So head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Baumgartner to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now, the big areas are really fun because here the fill-in is, well, almost more important than the retouching. There is so much color going on this painting that just about any retouching would look good, but if the fill-in isn't right, well, it's going to look terrible. And with a raking light, you can see just how important capturing the texture of the paint applied by the artist in this fill-in is. If these areas were flat, the color matching wouldn't matter. You would see it from a mile away. Now, once all of the fill-in has dried, I got to remove the excess because, of course, it's excess and I don't want it covering up the original paint because then I would have to retouch over that and I would be retouching over the original. So using a dampened swab, I will come back and lift off the excess and then kind of burnish it down with my hand so that it's a little bit softer. Some of those peaks were a little bit too crisp. I'll come back with a dental tool, scrape off some of the excess that I couldn't get at with the swab, and generally make sure that I'm satisfied with the texture. And this is a slow-going process, but one that's actually kind of therapeutic. Working sculpturally, making sure that this texture all looks great, feels really, really good. Once all of that fill-in is removed, I can now finally use the stretcher for its intended purpose, providing support to the painting. I'll leave on all of that bracing because, well, it's holding everything together and making sure that the stretcher stays square, which is something that I want when I stretch a painting. Sometimes the mere act of stretching a painting can cause the support to distort, and then all of a sudden you don't have a square, but you have a parallelogram, and you get the privilege of starting over. As I normally do, I'll start in the middle and work towards the corners, and this is mostly a force of habit. I do this because if there is any slack in the canvas, I can push it to the corners and pull it tight and get rid of it. Here, that's not really an issue because of the interleaf. The canvas isn't mobile. It's immobilized with that rigid piece of PET film. I'll use my pulling pliers only to save my hands because working on larger paintings can fatigue them, and they are important to me and the success of this painting. Once the painting has been married to the support, I will remove all of this bracing, and it's served its purpose. It will now go into the corner of the studio to collect dust for several years until I unceremoniously throw it away. And now I can remove all of the excess canvas from this lining, cutting it off and then tucking it under, folding it, and then tacking it. And even though I do this with every painting, because I've spent so much time working on this painting, months in fact, every little step I do to finish it feels extra special to me somehow. Now, while I was stretching it, I noticed that the span on the long edge was pretty large. It was almost 4 feet, and that's a little bit too large for me without a support, a crossbar. So I'm going to make one. I have a jig here that allows me to cut a slot, a mortise for the key, on the proper angle. So setting my table saw to the correct height and distance, I will just remove 1/8 of material from this piece of wood that I intend to use as the crossbar. I'll do the other side, slowly, meticulously, but trusting that this jig will do its job. And then I can take it over and install it onto the support. I'll orient this crossbar on the center of this large span, make a mark with my pencil, and then, me being me, of course, I have modeled up and 3D printed some brackets that I will use to hold everything in place. These fit in between the original stretcher and the new crossbar. They can be screwed into the original stretcher with countersink screws on 4 locations, and they have a little slot that allows me to install a key, thus enabling the expansion of this support in the middle. Sometimes when we key out a painting in the corners, the middle doesn't move as much. The support can bow and we get slack, which causes us to key the stretcher out more, which isn't good. This is why we have crossbars. But a crossbar that isn't keyable isn't really effective, and that's why I've designed this to receive a key. This key will enable me to expand this section of the canvas by tapping in this key. It moves the crossbar and it adds tension. Once it's in place, I'll add one more screw in this slotted hole. This screw can be loosened and the key can be tapped out more to add more tension without removing anything else. And then, as I normally do, I will bind the key in place with some fishing line and a smaller tack. And then I think we're ready to start retouching. Well, almost. We're going to go ahead and apply an isolation layer or saturation layer or first varnish layer, whatever you want to call it, to this painting. There is so much retouching and so much fill-in medium that 1, I want to make sure I get the colors right, but 2, I want to make sure that the fill-in medium doesn't absorb all of that retouching paint and leave it matte when I apply the final varnish, which can sometimes happen, and I've learned my lesson this way. By applying this thicker resin, it will effectively seal up all those areas of fill-in. It will make the painting look much richer, and it will make sure that when I retouch, my colors match, and when I varnish, nothing gets matte and blotchy. Retouching a painting like this, where there are a lot of losses, a lot of impasto, and a lot of active brushwork, is really a joy, as compared to something like a face, which is really precise and really, really high stakes, and kind of really stressful. This is much looser, this is much more interpretive, and much freer. The colors have to match, the brushwork has to match, of course, but you can see how much more forgiving this painting is for retouching than something like a tear through an eyeball. Here, I can just kind of work a little bit looser. The brush can be a little bit freer. The colors have to be accurate, but they can be in the ballpark. And there are really very few areas where I can make a mistake. And so compared to most of the retouching I do, this is a breath of fresh air and one that is actually really fun. Believe it or not, I am enjoying myself here. And another reason I'm enjoying myself is because the impact of this tear on the painting is so dramatic. This is not a little scratch or a little chip or even a small pinhole or tear. This is a chasm of missing paint. And it really does break up this beautiful scene. But as I retouch it, as I effectively erase the damage, it starts to come together. My eye no longer starts to focus on the damage, but I can start to see the water lilies, and I can see the water. I can see the reflections. And that's starting to make the painting feel more complete. And so another reason this is a really exciting area to retouch is because the impact that I'm having on this painting is profound. Yes, stabilizing it structurally was huge. And yes, cleaning it, again, huge. But getting rid of the damage, making the image come back together, at least on this painting, feels outsized. It feels like for a relatively little amount of work that I'm doing here, and it's not little, it's a lot. There's a lot of retouching. It's still fun retouching, but it's a lot of retouching. But for that work, I'm getting dividends paid back. The painting is coming together. We're seeing so much more than we could before the damage, and that makes conservation feel really great. This is not to say that it is all easy. One of the things that makes a painting like this sometimes tricky is that the artist painted wet on wet. There was a lot of mixing of colors on the canvas. And so what you have in a relatively small area, let's say a 1-inch square, you may have 15 or 25 different colors. And you can't just choose one color and say, well, it's good enough, it's close enough. Some people do that, but your eye will see that. You have to mix all of them, which means that you're constantly changing the color, making it a little bit more green, a little bit more blue, a little bit lighter, a little bit cooler, adding a little bit of yellow. Oop, now adding a little bit of red to compensate for too much yellow. Now adding a little bit of black, now brown, so on and so forth. And it's a constantly revisiting the palette, changing the color, adding a little bit of paint, changing the color, and doing it over and over again. And that can be time consuming. It can also be frustrating because you have to mix so many different colors. You're constantly working this problem. You're constantly changing. And just when you have a color that matches, that's perfect, you have to change it. I suppose in some respects, it's a lot like being a parent. Once you start to figure out the chaos of a newborn and become accustomed to it, well, they're no longer newborns. They're toddlers. And there's a whole new set of chaos that you have to adapt to. And once you figure out toddlers, well, guess what? They're no longer toddlers anymore. And all the tricks that you've learned, all the mastery is no longer relevant, and you have to reinvent yourself. But maybe, I don't know, maybe that's a metaphor for life, that you got to keep moving forward, because standing still is the surest way to be left behind. Now, when it comes to signatures and retouching, I don't. I will retouch all of the damage around the signature and through the signature, but I will do so with the background color, thus leaving the damage. And I have found in working with dealers, auction houses, galleries, and collectors that the only thing worse than a missing signature is one that fluoresces. And so eliminating that as a possibility goes a long way in instilling confidence in any future buyers and the reputation of the painting, the dealer, and the conservator. And so without further ado, I just want you to see this.
I'm ready. Well, I believe it is a miracle. Boy, the colors look like they were going to be quite nice. Wow, it was a nicely done painting by him too.
Yeah, and so this is Alfred Jürgens, correct?
Alfred Jürgens, yes.
Alfred Jürgens. This is a really well done painting. Mm-hmm. This is it looks deceptively easy. Paint a landscape with lilies, some water, but the more time I spent with this painting, the better it got for me.
Sure,
his handling of color, his handling of space.
And the interesting thing is that there's still a tremendous amount of original pigment that was still in place.
Being taken by a tornado and potentially thrown into a tree.
Thrown to a tree.
It got pretty lucky. I mean, Obviously, somebody who rescued it kept it in fairly good condition. And most importantly, nobody tinkered with it.
Exactly.
Nobody's brother's, uncle's, friend's, neighbor who went to art school or likes to paint decided they would have a go at it, which, as you know, is always the thing that we have to compensate for. That's always the thing that makes a project more complicated and makes its final outcome much more of a question.
Yeah, a rubber cement. Oh, that will hold it together.
That's right, right. So here we had a painting that, while catastrophically damaged and had some post-damage problems, was still relatively intact, untampered with, and just needed a lot of time invested. Now, the biggest issue we had were the tears.
Correct.
And these were massive tears running across the entire painting. And over the 60 plus years that the painting sat in storage, through multiple humidity and expansion and contraction cycles, the canvas shrunk and that gap opened up. So initially, upon the damage, the canvas would line up perfectly. Over time, that gap opened up to about 1.5 inches.
I was going to say it's 1.5 inches or
Yep.
so.
So we had a big gap. And now the easy way would be cut a piece of canvas, stick it in there, fill it in, retouch it. The problem with that is that the image will never line up. You'll get these distortions. So what we did was, using a tool that we built, was to slowly, over the course of maybe 2.5 months, kind of every day, pulling it closed a little bit. We're talking 0.5 millimeter at a time. Every morning I'd come in, do a little bit, tighten up the contraption. Next day, do it again. Next day, do it again, so on and so forth. And by moving really slowly and methodically, we can avoid the biggest problem with stretching a painted canvas is, well, you fix this one spot, and now you got a problem over here. Correct. You've distorted this section while working on this section. But we were able to get that gap closed tremendously. And then, of course, you mentioned the impasto, the paint texture. That was a godsend from Jurgens. Having that much paint to work with, having that much texture, really allows us to, kind of camouflage and hide where the tear was. We have to build up that paint layer to match the surrounding texture, and in that, it enables us to make that disappear more. If this was a perfectly smooth painting, or heavens forbid, just had a fine canvas texture, hiding that would be almost impossible. But here, we kind of got lucky. Big painting, a lot of canvas, a lot of material to work with. Nobody tinkered with it, and a lot of impasto. So all the things that could possibly go right did, and that's why we have the painting here today.
And the deal with it too is that you were able to work the canvas so close to each other. Now the inpainting is not like filling in with another piece of linen. It is now only filling in with pigment.
Right. And instead of using a big, thick house painter's brush, we can use our little brushes. So, the amount of material we had to add, while more than, would have been ideal, was certainly less than we expected and less than we thought when we first saw the painting.
I think it's one of those miracles that only took 60 years to happen.
So less exciting than the front, but no less important, is the back. And of course, we had to do a lot of structural repair to this painting because it was structurally unsound. There were some markings up here, something maybe from an exhibition in the past.
Oh, got it. Okay.
And we saved those because we don't want to lose those. It's not something that you may be able to decipher. It's kind of beyond my pay grade. But the support was largely okay. One thing that we did have to add was a center crossbar. Because this is a big span, and I just wasn't comfortable with that. So we added the crossbar, and we 3D printed some brackets here to hold it in place so that it stays off the canvas and can be keyed out. So even though we don't necessarily need the tension of keying because it's an interleafed painting, the keying still keeps everything tight and holds it together. And of course we put our logo on there, so we are now bonded to this painting in perpetuity.
There we go.
Or until the next tornado and it all
That's right.
goes to pot again. So this painting is for sale.
It will be for sale, yes.
Okay. Yes. So anybody who would be interested in this painting should know that it could be theirs.
It could be theirs, absolutely, yes. And I think they would own a very nice painting by a very interesting artist that came to them through incredible circumstances.
To say the least. For Kim, the question never was, is this painting worth saving? His dealer sense and his gut told him that indeed it was. And for me, the question was never, can this be saved? For I've seen my fair share of turnarounds. But knowing it was worth saving and knowing it could be saved are a far cry from it actually being saved. And this was no easy feat. Pulling those tears together took a tremendous amount of time and wouldn't have been possible without specially built tools. The retouching, while exciting and fun, was still monumental. But watching the image come back together was a reward in and of itself. To say nothing of revealing the beautiful colors hidden beneath all of that grime. And now it's possible for Kim to turn the page on a tragic incident and look forward to the future. And while Kim may have said it was a miracle, I'd like to think that it was just another day's work in the studio, pulling it together.